Upheaval, Breaking Point, Chapter 30, Fire and Fury.
3 days had passed since Twilight and Vanguard's public flogging, and the siege was well underway. With no quick victory in sight, the Wolven settled down to cutting off supplies to Bastion City. Squads of bolters were placed in strategic positions, ready to shoot down any Pegasus attempting to fly in or out of the city. Despite the destruction of several of them, the catapults continued to fire upon the walls in the slow process of bringing them down. Wolven miners began to dig tunnels to undermine the structural integrity of the city's defenses as well. Earlier, they had discovered tunnels already made and tried to use those. In response, the defenders of Bastion City dug in and prepared for a defensive war. Rations were strictly controlled at the start to make sure that no supplies were wasted. Unicorn Magi guarded the walls in shifts to weaken catapult attacks with telekinesis. When Wolven miners began to move in, the Legion spotted the tunnels and sent ponies to countermine. They discovered the ready-made tunnels and sent ponies to collapse them on top of the Wolven who had tried to use them. The result of the clash of tactics was a temporary stalemate, something that greatly displeased the King of Wolvengard. At the heart of his army, Fenra pawed the snow-covered ground in a rage. As far as he was concerned, stalemate meant that Torado was winning. To further worsen his temper, he had noticed that Luna's scent had moved far, far away. He did not put it beyond Torado to have Luna nearby to tantalize him, and then send her away as an insult. Fenra knew that he had to strike a blow. It did not need to be the spectacular shattering of the city's walls, but it had to be a blow against cursed Torado's legion, so he could remind all of them, Wolven and Thunderfoot alike, that he had the upper paw. For all his savagery, Fenra knew the importance of subtlety. A direct attack was not practical. The defenses were still too strong. While he believed that if he hurled his entire army at the city, he could overwhelm it, he decided against the idea. This was going to be a prolonged campaign. A single city captured was not enough. He planned on marching straight into cursed Celestia's capital itself and seizing Luna once and for all. To do that, he had to preserve his troops as much as possible. His first few moves required a different sort of approach.
Moonshadow!
He growled. The other Wolven, even the mighty Brachyri that surrounded him, quailed at his voice. At his command, his trusted ally appeared before him. Moonshadow had just recently returned from a disastrous mission that left her stranded on the moon for 1,000 years. Her most recent mission had been a success, and Fenra counted on that trend to continue. His ally appeared as a white, horned thunderfoot ablaze in black flame. Moonshadow always did have a preference for taking on the guise of their enemies, and this time was no different.
"I am here, Fenra,"
Moonshadow replied. She addressed the giant wolf as an equal rather than a servant, a privilege given to no one else.
Does cursed Torado know you've returned?
"I have hidden my presence well. He thinks that I was destroyed completely when I was expelled from his sister."
Good. I want you to hurt his legion. Sneak into their city and hurt them. Remind the Thunderfoots that they are not safe. Leave before Torado catches your scent.
"I will."
As Moonshadow left Fenra's presence, the other Wolven backed away from her warily. They could still smell the scent of Thunderfoot around her, but it was an odor tainted by something so unnatural that none of them dared to even stand close.
"You think that you can just dance your way into Bastion City?" Pyre Valor asked from within.
She had allowed Nightmare Moon more control while they remained among the Wolven. She didn't know how her hated enemies behaved, and she didn't want to do something stupid, such as provoke their king.
"Of course not,"
Nightmare Moon replied.
"But you can. You've lived there before becoming a Legionnaire, didn't you? You would know a thing or two about your city's mighty defenses."
"You've been peering into my memories."
"Not really, but thank you for confirming what I thought."
They left the Wolven camp in silence after that. They were a good distance away from the sentries when Nightmare Moon spoke again.
"Angry again? You have the temper of a newborn volcano, Pyre Valor. I wonder how you managed to not incinerate your friends for such a long time."
"You know nothing of friendship," Pyre growled. Out here in the open plain, Nightmare Moon allowed her to control. The mere term was not something she quite grasped, even after the time she spent with the spirit. She was still getting used to her new state of being. Being possessed was more than just carrying a passenger. Nightmare Moon didn't sit inside a room with her, fiddling away with some sort of metaphysical controls, moving her body about like a puppet. They were fused together. Two wills sharing a single body. Even establishing and maintaining control was a complicated affair. The two of them didn't take turns. Pyre Valor felt as if she had complete control over her body at all times. However, when she would so much as lift a hoof, she had to contend with Nightmare Moon's will. If Nightmare Moon had other plans for that hoof, she would experience some resistance. She guessed that it must be the same for Nightmare Moon. Moving at all required a degree of harmony between them. If they couldn't agree on what to do, then their body would be stuck. An unspoken system had developed between the two of them over time. Nightmare Moon seemed content to allow Pyre to move about most of the time, making suggestions whenever she deemed it necessary. Pyre guessed that so long as she behaved in a manner that aided the Wolven, this would be the case. The sharing wasn't complete, however. Nightmare Moon heard her thoughts and could use her magic, but the opposite wasn't true. Clearly, equality wasn't part of the bargain. Pyre pushed out those thoughts for now. Fenra had given them orders, and she was willing to do as the King of Wolvengard asked. She didn't have to do it alone, either. Far away from the city in the Wolven camp was a small tent where one pony waited. When the Wolven made their way to Bastion City, Pyre had asked Blademane to run ahead and make camp away from the Wolven army. He had complied without a single protest, as he had done since she decided to do this. Blademane was sitting in front of his tent and tending a small fire. As soon as he spotted Pyre, he stood up and at attention. Pyre felt a twinge in her chest whenever she saw that. Blademane continued to act that she was his captain, even though it was clear that they were caught in circumstances where that title meant nothing. She had asked him already why he stayed. All he answered was, "I am on your side." "I'm going to infiltrate Bastion City through an old entrance I know," Pyre said. "From there, I'm going to launch a quick raid to shake them up a bit."
Do you need assistance?
Blademane asked without hesitation. Pyre nodded. "It's a small passage where Vanguard and I played in as children," she replied. "It's well hidden and should still be there. I can't bring a large group, so you'll do as backup."
Understood. When do we leave?
Nightfall. The past 3 days had been relatively easy for Twilight Sparkle. She was starting to get the hang of boulder catching, and she had managed to stay out of trouble. She had also been granted access to some of the Legion's surviving spellbooks, a chance she happily jumped at. Finally, she was going to read actual spellbooks from the Barrier Lands. Pyre Valor's notes had been an important source of spells, but she could move past beginning spells that had been cast aside. She expected the first book she read to be an eye-opener to the Barrier Lands' approach to magic. And it was. She had expected it already, given that these were spellbooks collected by the Legion. There were no mustache-growing spells here, only page after page of combat spells. The variety of ways by which the unicorns of the Barrier Lands had developed to hurt and kill was outright frightening. Fireball, with all its heat and intensity, was just the beginning. Just by flipping through pages, she found a spell that sucked all the water out of its victim, a spell that boiled the blood within its victim's veins, and a spell that filled its victim's lungs with poisonous gas. Was it really necessary to try to be so creative in order to kill an enemy? However, Mage Captain Owlsight had her put away the advanced combat spells. "You have a reliable offensive spell, Recruit Sparkle. I suggest you pick up some defensive spells first. Shield is a good starting point," he had said. Twilight considered it good advice. She started on some basic defensive spells, and worked on them whenever she had some free time. At the end of another day of boulder catching and training along with the other recruits, Twilight made her way back home, where she would spend more time studying. "Hey, Sparkle!" Twilight looked to her side to find some of the recruits in her group waving at her. "We're off to get some drinks at Stormbrew's new place. Want to come along?" One of the recruits asked. Twilight shook her head with a smile. "I'll pass," she replied. "I've got some more studying to do." "Bookworm!" the recruit called out good-naturedly. They went on, talking amongst themselves. Twilight couldn't help but notice that she had been getting along quite well with her group, especially since the past 2 days. She rounded the corner of one street with a little hurry in her step. It was close to evening, and she didn't want to waste any time before getting to sleep. She was still a few more corners from her home when she stopped. At just by the next corner, she spotted Vanguard Clash and Scarlet Rabbit. "Vanguard!" she called out. The two saw her and waved in acknowledgement. "Are the two of you still on duty?" she asked once she got close enough. "No," Scarlet answered. "But the captain here suddenly had a hunch or something and wants to check something out." Twilight looked to Vanguard curiously.
There are ways into this city besides the main gates,
Vanguard said.
I remember an old passageway by the western walls. I want to check it out, in case it might turn into a problem later.
Want to join us? Scarlet asked.
Scarlet, this isn't some outing,
Vanguard said sternly. Why not? We brought Applejack with us last time.
That has nothing to do with this,
Vanguard said as he turned towards Twilight.
You should be resting,
he told her.
Your back hasn't fully recovered, I take it.
You're the one with the 40 lashes still on you, Twilight replied. She had wanted to know more about what Vanguard did around the city. Besides, I don't mind coming along. Great, Scarlet crowed. The more the merrier.
There is nothing merry about this,
Vanguard insisted sternly.
We're just going to check if that passage is still there. I'm not even sure if I'm remembering it right.
The three of them made their way to the western portion of the walls as evening continued to settle. It was already dark by the time they made it there. Vanguard led them through a veritable maze of smaller side streets, leaving Twilight completely lost. So, how do you know about this passage? She asked Vanguard.
I used to play a lot around these parts when I was a colt,
Vanguard explained.
Pyre and I found that passage and used it to sneak out of the city at times.
Why would you want to sneak out of the city?
Survival camping when we were younger. Dueling tournaments when we were a bit older.
Dueling is illegal within city limits, Scarlet added with a grin. Twilight raised an eyebrow. Duels, as in you fought other ponies?
I thought it was a good way to test ourselves before we joined the Legion. Pyre wanted to throw herself at every aspiring unicorn as soon as she learned her first combat spell.
Didn't you ever get caught?
The other participants had their routes discovered. Ours never was. Maybe some pony has already found it and closed it up. Or we could have a potential entry point to the city.
It seems there's a lot of... Twilight began. Before she could continue, Vanguard suddenly raised a hoof to stop them. They had stopped in front of a deserted alleyway. Twilight was a little taken aback at the scattered rubble in it. It seemed that this place was used to store old construction equipment. Bits of wood were scattered about, along with old pieces of scaffolding and sacks of broken stones. But as she looked ahead, Twilight realized why Vanguard and Scarlet had stopped. At the end of the alley stood two ponies. One of them was a white unicorn with a long, wild black mane. The other was a large brown earth pony. Twilight recognized them at once.
Pyre Valor,
Vanguard growled. His hoof went to the two-bladed sword strapped to his harness. Twilight steeled herself for a fight. Pyre Valor looked shocked at the mere sight of Vanguard, but the shock was immediately replaced by an angry glare when the white unicorn's eyes focused on her. Blademane stepped forward protectively.
Go for backup, Scarlet,
Vanguard said right before he clamped down on the hilt of his weapon. Scarlet hesitated for a second, and then nodded before flying off. He was the fastest, and it fell on him to call up reinforcements. He didn't like the idea of leaving his captain with Pyre Valor and Blademane, however. The last time he did that, Vanguard was nearly roasted. He hoped that Twilight Sparkle's presence will change that outcome. The moment Scarlet flew off, Blademane charged at Vanguard, who met it with a charge of his own. The two crashed into each other with a loud metallic bang. Blademane had slammed his head against Vanguard's and kept it in place to prevent the two-bladed sword from slicing him up. Pyre Valor's horn flashed dark red before she disappeared. Twilight saw a flash of red on top of a nearby building.
Twilight, don't let her run around loose,
Vanguard shouted.
But be careful.
Twilight nodded and cast her own teleportation spell, reappearing on top of the same building Pyre Valor had teleported onto. With Twilight gone, Vanguard pushed Blademane away and swiped at the brown stallion with his weapon. The blade cut between the plates of Blademane's barding, leaving a deep gash just between his right shoulder and foreleg. Blademane jumped back and hesitated. The narrow space would make it difficult for Vanguard to swing his massive weapon about, but he knew that his former captain had fought in similar situations before. His best bet was to keep at the center of the two blades and beat down Vanguard with his tramplers. The narrow alley should keep Vanguard's swings to short ones. The two of them charged at each other once more. Blademane encountered another problem as he butted heads with Vanguard. His former captain's Nightsteel fullplate was much stronger than his regular barding. His champron dented on impact, causing stars to burst in his vision. He ignored the pain and reared up to strike with his front tramplers. Vanguard mimicked the move, locking them in a shoving match with their forelegs against each other's. The blades stuck out just above their forelegs, Blademane put his entire weight into shoving Vanguard back, but despite being smaller, Vanguard proved difficult to budge. Suddenly, Vanguard fell backwards. The lack of resistance pulled Blademane off balance, sending him falling forward. With Blademane above him, Vanguard put both of his hind legs against the bigger stallion's belly and kicked upwards, knocking Blademane into the air before turning his head to one side so that Blademane's unprotected belly would land on his weapon's edge. Realizing his predicament, Blademane twisted in midair to avoid being gutted. He collapsed clumsily on his back, just a foot from Vanguard, who had already rolled to his hoofs. Blademane rolled in time as the two-bladed sword thrust into the ground just where his exposed belly was. Panting, he got to his hoofs. Blood continued to pour from his injured foreleg, staining the ground beneath him.
You said that the only pony who knew of that passage was dead.
That was him. It looks like we somehow came upon the same idea at the same time.
We're going to have a discussion on how you see the word dead.
Pyre ignored Nightmare Moon for a while and looked around from her vantage point. She didn't have much time to cause some damage. A few fire spells at a food storage building should give the Legion a wake-up call. She thought of heading for the main gates and blowing them up, but that required a lot of empowerment from Nightmare Moon. With Prince Torado so close, Nightmare Moon didn't want to risk it. And that was with regular gates. Bastion City's gates were now heavily guarded and magically reinforced. The Legion learned quickly from past mistakes, and Fangbreaker Fortress's fall was a very stark lesson indeed.
Stop!
Pyre turned around to find that the Purple Chosen had followed her. Her temper flared at the sight of the Legion mage coat on a miserable Chosen. She wasn't the only one to recognize this night sparkle, however. She also felt some of Nightmare Moon's realization as well.
This miserable Chosen will be the first to die.
Stand down.
What? You do not command me, Pyre Valor.
I said stand down. The ferocious resistance that Nightmare Moon encountered made her hesitate. Her first impulse was to fight back and remind Pyre Valor just who possessed who, but having a contest of wills now would be disastrous. She would have to exert a lot of her power, and that may very well alert Prince Torado. Not only that, she recognized this unicorn. This was the bearer of the element of magic, the central figure of the elements of harmony that had purged her from Princess Luna. The rest of the elements may be here as well. It may be for the best to let Pyre Valor deal with them for now. Pyre felt Nightmare Moon's presence within her recede. With her body under control, she took a step towards her hated enemy, her horn already glowing with magic. Take off that mage coat, Chosen filth, she snarled. I've never seen a bigger insult to the Legion. You're going to pay for this, Night Sparkle. This coat is standard issue to every Unicorn Legionnaire, Twilight replied, her horn glowing as well. That includes me. By the way, it's Twilight Sparkle. Take it off, or I will burn every inch of your skin. Pyre's snarl turned into a low, dangerous tone. You threatened a scared unicorn who stumbled into this land without knowing anything, Pyre Valor, Twilight replied. I'm not that same unicorn. For once, she wasn't afraid of this unicorn. The two of them faced off on a wide, flat rooftop, a couple of stories from the ground. The roof was covered with a thin layer of snow, making it a bit slippery. She kept her footing, however. Is that so? A sphere of white-hot flames flew from Pyre's horn. Recognizing a fireball, Twilight answered with one of hers. The two spheres collided between them and exploded, bathing the rooftop in searing heat. Twilight stepped back and raised a portion of her mage coat to protect her from the blast. You think you've seen fire? You haven't seen anything! To Twilight's horrified surprise, 4 enormous burning boulders flew from the blast as it dissipated. Each one was about the size of an adult pony, covered with burning cracks and ablaze in lurid red flame. She cast a teleportation spell in time and emerged several feet directly behind Pyre Valor. She appeared just in time to see the boulders converge on where she was standing and explode with a deafening boom. Half the rooftop erupted in flames, scattering bits of stone and wood across the entire area. One of the boulders had missed its mark and struck the building on the other side of the alley where Vanguard was. Smoke and flames began to spread from that building. Twilight swallowed hard as she saw the destruction. Pyre Valor was right. She thought she had seen how dangerous fire spells were. She had no idea. Now, it was clear why something as dangerous as Fireball was in Pyre Valor's beginner notes. There was no time to look at just how much damage that last fire spell had done, however. There was something wrong with where she was standing. She was faced with Pyre Valor's back, and she should have some kind of advantage, but that was when she noticed a small glint of red from the corner of her eye. She looked down to find what appeared to be a small ruby pulsating with red light. Suddenly realizing that she was in terrible danger, she cast another teleportation spell. The gem flared up briefly, and then exploded, all but destroying the other side of the roof and leaving only the middle section intact. Twilight reappeared to Pyre's side, her body smoking from several burns. Her teleportation had saved her life, but not without some of the flames actually reaching her. Pyre Valor quickly rushed Twilight and slammed a front hoof into her face, knocking her down. Twilight tried to focus, with Pyre just a foot away and closing in. There was no time for any difficult spell. She concentrated on her telekinesis, enveloping Pyre in a purple nimbus. Pyre's horn flashed with magic, breaking Twilight's telekinetic grip. She slammed another hoof into her prone opponent's face, rubbing it against the rooftop. "That was pathetic!" she snarled. She pounded on Twilight's face repeatedly, trying to take out an unquenchable rage. "Weakling! Chosen filth! They may as well let insects into the Legion!" The violent pounding only increasing her rage, Pyre grabbed a hunk of Twilight's mane with her teeth and pulled the purple unicorn to her hoofs, only to hurl her to the ground to her opposite side. Faced with an overwhelming attack, you so predictably teleported towards the exact opposite direction it was heading towards. Did you think I wouldn't expect that? And using telekinesis, the first spell any unicorn thinks of a counterspell when facing another unicorn? Moron! Twilight covered her face with her forelegs as another assault of hoofs rained down on her. Her horn flashed briefly, and her body was covered in an almost invisible screen of protective magic. The blows continued to hurt, but they did much less damage. Pyre Valor trampled her opponent relentlessly, uncaring of what had happened down at the alley where she left Blademane to deal with Vanguard. She noticed the quick spell cast, but didn't care. To her mind, armor was a weak basic spell, yet more proof at how pathetic her opponent was. "You stand against me as if you had a chance," she snarled. "I fought unicorns worth 10 of you. When was the last time you looked at a unicorn and thought to yourself, how can I beat her? Miserable!" Pyre Valor's tirade stopped, as suddenly her left foreleg refused to move.
"That's enough,"
Nightmare Moon snarled within her mind.
"We've wasted too much time on this pony. Kill her and let's go. We can't harm the Legion much as it is, and Toronto may very well be upon us soon."
Pyre tried to lift her other hoof, only to encounter the same resistance.
"Enough trampling. She's helpless. Burn her to a crisp."
Pyre's horn flared with a dark red light as she readied a killing spell. Before she could cast it, however, she heard the distant sound of wings flapping. On impulse, she jumped to one side, just as a bolt flew towards her. "Hold still while I skewer you, Pyre!" Scarlet Rabbit shouted. He pulled another bolt from the case strapped to his flank and reloaded for another shot. Behind him, several Pegasi aimed their crossbows at the white unicorn. Before they could fire, however, their target suddenly burst into black flames. A thick bank of black smoke quickly filled the burning remains of the rooftop. The Pegasi fired their weapons at where they estimated Pyre Valor still was, but couldn't tell if they hit anything. The smoke shifted towards the alley near the building, moving as if it were a living creature. In the alley, Vanguard and Blademane were still fighting. Blademane was now sporting several cuts to his chest and forelegs. His barding was dented in several places, and he was breathing heavily. Vanguard was bleeding from one nostril and had several bruises just beneath the barding of his forelegs. Vanguard was about to charge again when smoke suddenly filled the alley. Gagging, he stumbled out of the cloud. As quickly as it had appeared, the smoke seemed to flow right into the passageway at the end of the alley, and then disappeared. He looked around. Blademane was gone as well. He immediately looked upwards to the roof, where Twilight had teleported to. He saw Scarlet hovering about, directing Pegasi to help out in controlling the damage.
"Scarlet," he called out. "How's Twilight?"
"Pyre kicked her flank pretty badly," Scarlet shouted back. "But she'll be fine. Just some burns and bruises." Vanguard shook his head. That can't bode well. He was at least thankful that he had intercepted Pyre Valor and Blademane before they could do any serious damage. All they had to deal with was fire and some injuries. Right now, he was torn with feeling stupid that he had brought Twilight along and ended up getting her hurt, again, and feeling relieved that Twilight was there to delay Pyre until reinforcements came along. He sighed and stepped out of the alley. He should at least help control the damage. The following morning, Vanguard found Twilight by her desk with several open spellbooks. Her burns proved to be minor, but she was still bound in bandages. Her face was also pretty swollen. Though it looked as if she had a hard time looking through the swelling around her right eye, she continued to read. The look of determination on her face made him loath to bother her. Around them, the rest of their friends were still asleep. The sun had yet to rise after all.
"Have you slept an hour, at least?"
"I'm fine," she replied.
Those spells are useless if you're too tired to cast them.
Twilight paused from her reading and looked at Vanguard. Then tell me what else I can do, she said. Vanguard was taken aback by the fierce expression. You know her best. Tell me, how do I beat Pyre Valor? Vanguard let out a sigh before answering.
Learning more spells is just part of the solution,
He said.
You're a very book-smart pony. You need to translate that to fighting knowledge. Sharpen your reflexes and learn all the little tricks that will help you win.
How do I do that?
The quickest way is to pit yourself against other unicorns. Throw yourself into combat often enough, and you'll get better.
Vanguard expected hesitation from Twilight, maybe even some revulsion. He didn't expect grim determination. This could be bad. Pyre lit more fires than just the ones he helped put out yesterday.
A word of caution, Twilight Sparkle,
He added. What is it?
If you walk Pyre's path, you'll end up where Pyre is.
I'll keep that in mind.
Take it to heart. Keeping things in mind is why your face is a swollen mess.
Twilight didn't answer. She had been taking things too easy and underestimating this land. Magic was her specialty. It was about time every pony else saw that.